Imagine you are a pearl diver in 1920. Not a romantic postcard version of the Gulf, not sunsets and folklore. The real version, strip of sand where the wind never stops, where fresh water is a rumor, where your home is a tent stitched together from necessity and resignation. Every morning is the same ritual. You tie a stone to your body like an anchor. You breathe deep, and then you drop into dark water that squeezes your ribs as if the sea itself wants payment. You don't dive for adventure. You dive because hunger doesn't negotiate. Down there, you're blind and frantic, fingers raking across oyster shells. You can't stay long. You surface coughing salt, eyes stinging, chest burning. And sometimes you open an oyster and find nothing. Again and again. That was the economy. That was the future. A civilization balanced on the probability that an animal might have formed something pretty. For centuries, this worked barely. Qatar and its neighbors supplied natural pearls to the world's rich Indian Maharajas, European aristocrats, elites who wore tiny shimmering spheres on their bodies without ever asking what it cost in lungs, in lives, in drowned men whose names never made records. Entire coastal communities depended on that trade. It wasn't just work. It was identity. The sea fed you, and it could take you back whenever it felt like it. And then the market turned. Not slowly, not politely. It turned like a knife. In the 1920s and 1930s, a Japanese innovator, Kokichi Mikamoto, perfected cultured pearls manufactured with technique instead of suffering. They were cheaper, consistent, and good enough for the global luxury market. And once the world learned it could buy beauty without paying for danger, the Gulf's pearl economy became obsolete almost overnight. Then the Great Depression arrived like a second wave. Luxury demand collapsed. The tiny thread that held these societies together snapped. This is the part people forget when they look at today's Qatar with its glass towers and stadiums and sovereign wealth. Before the gas, before the planes, before the global brand. This place experienced a level of scarcity that rewires a nation's psychology. When your entire economy dies, you don't just lose income. You lose the story that explains why tomorrow will be better. There are oral histories from the era, desperate survival tactics. Families selling possessions for sacks of rice, people eating whatever protein they could find. Exact details vary because poverty doesn't produce clean spreadsheets. But the direction is unmistakable. The pearl collapse didn't inconvenience Qatar. It hollowed it. People left. Some went to Bahrain, some to Saudi Arabia, some just drifted wherever there was work. By the mid-20th century, Qatar's population had shrunk dramatically. Figures in historical accounts often circle around the idea of a very small community, something like tens of thousands, clinging to the edge of the Gulf, a forgotten peninsula. A minor footnote in the empire's accounting. And then, salvation appeared. But even salvation in this story arrives with cruel timing. In the late 1930s, geologists surveying the Deccan structure discovered oil. In 1939, Qatar confirmed commercially viable petroleum. This should have been the moment the lights turned on. Instead, the world went to war. World War II didn't just reshape Europe, it delayed futures in places like this. Shipping lanes became hunting grounds. Development plans became liabilities. The British Empire, still controlling Qatar as a protectorate, judged the risk too high. Wells were capped, work slowed. A population that had just been gutted by the collapse of its only industry was told again, wait. It wasn't until after the war that the promise became reality. Only in 1949 did the first shipment of Qatari oil meaningfully leave the country. And when money finally began to move, it did what resource money always does at first. It built the basics. Roads where sand tracks used to be. Power stations, schools, clinics, the kind of infrastructure that makes hunger less normal. For a moment, the story looked familiar. Gulf state discovers oil, escapes poverty, begins the long transformation. But here's the detail that matters. Qatar was never the oil titan people assume it was. Saudi Arabia was an ocean. Kuwait had depth. Abu Dhabi could fuel empires. Qatar, by comparison, was modest, enough to stabilize, enough to modernize, enough to become comfortable, not enough to become untouchable. which means Qatar's leadership faced an uncomfortable future. Oil could lift you, but it could also plateau. And in the Gulf, plateau isn't neutral. Plateau is vulnerability, means your neighbors outgrow you, means you stay small while the giants become permanent. Then came 1971, Qatar's formal independence from Britain. Yes, but also something far more consequential beneath the water. That year, Shell drilled an exploratory well north of the peninsula. They were hunting for more oil, something that could push Qatar into the same league. Instead, they found gas. And the reaction wasn't celebration. It was disappointment. To modern ears, this sounds insane. Because we live in a world where natural gas is a major pillar of energy transition, a geopolitical weapon, and when liquefied, one of the most valuable export commodities on Earth. But in the 1960s and 70s, gas was awkward. Gas was the ugly duckling of fossil fuels. Oil was liquid power. You could barrel it, ship it, sell it to anyone, anywhere. It ran cars, planes, navies. It ran empire. Gas was trapped. It wanted pipelines. It wanted nearby customers. And Qatar's geography looked like a dead end. One land neighbor, Saudi Arabia, already drowning in energy. No obvious route to global buyers. No established LNG industry, yet capable of turning gas into a portable liquid at national scale. So Shell walked away. And history laughed. Because what they had failed to find was the North Field, the largest non-associated natural gas field on the planet. Shared geologically with Iran's South Pars. The numbers are almost obscene. Hundreds of trillions of cubic feet of recoverable gas. Energy enough to power entire continents for decades. A resource so large it doesn't just change a country, it bends markets around it. But size alone doesn't make you rich. Not if you can't move it. Not if the world doesn't know what to do with it. A treasure is only a treasure when you can turn it into leverage. So Qatar lived in a strange limbo. Modest oil, immense gas, and no clear method to monetize it. This is where the story stops being geology and starts being strategy. Because somewhere inside that uncertainty, a single idea began to take shape. What if gas wasn't a problem, but a monopoly waiting to be engineered? And the person who stared hardest at that question wasn't a foreign oil executive. It was a Qatari prince studying the future like a countdown timer, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani, watching oil's limits and realizing something brutal. If Qatar didn't figure out how to export gas beyond pipelines, it could modernize and still end up back where it began, just with nicer buildings, just with better illusions. The solution was radical. It was expensive. It was terrifying to finance. Liquefied natural gas. LNG isn't just a commodity. It's a technological escape hatch. Cool gas to around minus 162 degrees Celsius. Compress its volume by roughly 600 times. And suddenly the pipeline problem disappears. Gas becomes shippable, portable, global. But in the 80s and early 90s, betting your nation on LNG was like betting your life savings on a machine nobody had proven could run at the scale you needed. It meant multi-billion-dollar liquefaction trains, specialized cryogenic fleets, ports, long-term contracts. Debt, so much debt you could drown in it if prices turned. Advisors warned it was too risky. Big companies hesitated. Some said no. Because if the gamble failed, Qatar wouldn't just lose a growth strategy, it would lose sovereignty. And that brings us to the moment where the modern Qatari state stops being a small Gulf monarchy and becomes something else, something colder, sharper, more ambitious. In 1995, Sheikh Hamad seized power in a bloodless palace coup while his father was abroad. Quiet, swift, absolute. The kind of transition that tells you how politics really works in small states. When the future is a ticking clock, hesitation is a luxury. And one of his first decisive moves was also the most dangerous. He decided to go Elon on LNG. Not as a side project, not as a pilot. As the foundation of a new empire. Because once you understand the power of LNG, you realize Qatar wasn't trying to get rich. Qatar was trying to become necessary. And in the next section, we enter the real story. The sovereign-scale gamble. The American partnership, the Japanese contracts that turned risk into guaranteed revenue. and the moment Qatar transformed natural gas into a global monopoly mechanism. It's 1995. Doha is not yet the glossy global showroom you picture today. Qatar is still small enough to feel fragile. The skyline hasn't grown its ego. The population is tiny. The state is wealthy compared to its own past, but compared to the giants around it, it's still the little peninsula with a short history and a dangerous address. And inside the palace, a calculation is being made that most countries never survive. Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani has taken power bloodless, fast, almost surgical. The kind of transition that doesn't ask permission from tradition. The kind that says, we're not going to drift into the future. We're going to build one. Here's what he saw that the previous leadership either avoided or refused to admit. Oil was comfort, not destiny. Oil can modernize a state, but it can also trap it in a mid-level ceiling. And Qatar's oil ceiling was real. The reserves were never in the same league as Saudi Arabia or Abu Dhabi. Qatar could become stable. It could become wealthy. But it could also become dependent, quiet, vulnerable. A small actor in a neighborhood where small actors eventually get coerced. So Sheikh Hamad stared at the North Field the world scale. Gas reservoir that foreign companies once dismissed stand. He saw a weapon nobody else had fully built yet. Not gas, a system. Because raw gas is useless if you can't move it. Pipelines are geography prisons. Pipelines make you beg neighbors for access. Pipelines make your economy hostage to border politics. Pipelines turn energy into regional power, at best not global power. Liquefied natural gas changes that LNG is not just a product. It's liberation from maps. And that liberation is expensive enough to bankrupt a nation if you miscalculate by even a few degrees. This is why the bet was insane. To build LNG at scale, Qatar had to do something that feels almost taboo when said out loud. It had to mortgage its own future. Think about it. In the mid-1990s, Qatar's economy was not a giant. It wasn't a continental superpower. Yet the LNG blueprint required investment that would eventually climb into the tens of billions. Liquefaction trains, ports, upstream development, tanker fleets, industrial cities built from scratch, pipelines inside the country feeding the plants, and contracts engineered to keep the whole machine running for decades. This wasn't spending. This was leverage. The kind of leverage where failure doesn't mean recession. Failure means creditors own your sovereignty. So how do you convince the world to lend you billions for a product many still viewed as too complex, too costly, too niche? You borrow credibility. Qatar needed muscle. Not military muscle, yet financial muscle. Engineering muscle. Institutional confidence. So they partnered with the Americans Mobil, which later became part of ExxonMobil. It was an almost perfect arrangement. Qatar had the gas. Mobil had the technical expertise, the project management experience, and the kind of brand name that made global banks relax their grip. Together, they built the twin pillars of the LNG empire, giant joint ventures that turned state ambition into industrial reality. And then they picked a stretch of coastline in the north, Ras Laffan. At the time, it was desert, empty, wind and sand, and the smell of nothing. Qatar turned it into one of the largest industrial zones on Earth. This is where the story becomes cinematic, because the scale is so extreme, it stops feeling real. Ras Laffan is not a facility. It's a mechanical ecosystem. Pipes like arteries, flare stacks like towers, steel skeletons stretching to the horizon. A place designed for one purpose. Take gas from the North Field and convert it into a liquid that the world can't live without. The heart of that ecosystem is the liquefaction train. The word train is misleading. It sounds like something cute and manageable. In LNG, a train is a building-sized refrigeration machine, industrial cold, powerful enough to force a stubborn substance into obedience. Natural gas is cooled to around -162 degrees Celsius. The molecules slow, the chaos compresses. The volume collapses roughly 600 times smaller. Suddenly, what used to require pipelines can fit into ships. Suddenly, Qatar is not selling gas. Qatar is selling ocean-crossing energy. But liquefying it is only half the nightmare. Because if you can produce LNG but can't move it efficiently, you've built a billion-dollar refrigerator in the desert for no reason. So Qatar did the next aggressive thing. It reinvented the tanker. Not with incremental upgrades, but a new class of ships so large they felt like floating cities. Kuflex and Kumax carriers. These ships weren't just transport. They were scale economics weaponized. A Kumax vessel can carry roughly 266,000 cubic meters of LNG massive compared to standard LNG carriers of the era. Bigger ship, more cargo per voyage, lower cost per unit. This is how monopolies are built, not with slogans, but with math. And here's the cruel irony that makes this story feel like history has a sense of humor. Remember Japan, the country whose cultured pearls helped collapse the Gulf pearl economy? Japan returned, not as a destroyer, as a buyer. Japan has almost no domestic energy resources. After the oil shocks of the 1970s, it developed a national obsession with energy security. It wanted stable suppliers. It wanted long-term contracts. It wanted predictability. Qatar's LNG was perfect portable energy from a country that could be stable, that could be predictable, that could sign contracts and actually keep them. So, Japanese utilities signed long-term take-or-pay style deals contracts that essentially said, "We will buy fixed volumes for decades, and we will pay even if demand fluctuates." This was the key that unlocked everything. Because contracts are not just commerce. Contracts are collateral. Those long-term agreements turned Qatar's gamble into bankable certainty, and certainty is what lenders want. Suddenly, the same financial institutions that would normally fear a sovereign-scale LNG bet began lining up to fund it. This is how Qatar turned LNG into a monopoly mechanism. Control the supply, Northfield scale solve. The transport problem, liquefaction plus supertankers. Lock in demand, long-term contracts with major importers, use guaranteed revenue to unlock global financing, build faster. Build bigger scales so hard that competitors struggle to match unit costs. Qmax economics. By the mid-2000s, the machine was complete. Qatar overtook older exporters and became the world's dominant LNG supplier for years because while others were still debating whether LNG was worth it, Qatar had already built the pipeline-to-ocean conversion system at maximum scale. And the money that followed didn't arrive like normal revenue. It arrived like a hose. A sustained surge of state income so large it creates a new problem most countries never face. When a small country suddenly earns more than it can reasonably spend at home. What do you do with the overflow? Because if you just spend its subsidies, vanity projects, bloated bureaucracy, history shows you the ending. Commodity prices dip. Revenue collapses. The state panics. The dream evaporates. The old poverty returns, wearing modern clothes. Sheikh Hamad understood this. He had watched the region. He knew that sudden wealth can be a trap if you treat it like a party instead of a conversion. So Qatar made the next move. It didn't just want to be rich. It wanted to turn revenue into ownership assets that would pay Qatar long after the gas stopped being magic. That is where the story goes next. The Sovereign Wealth Fund. The buying spree that quietly turned pieces of London into Qatari property. The strategy of embedding itself into the financial infrastructure of other great powers. And then, the most dangerous twist of all. Because once you buy influence, you also buy enemies. And Qatar's enemies don't just dislike it, they try to starve it into submission. That's next. By the mid-2000s, Qatar had crossed a threshold that very few countries ever reach. The problem was no longer, how do we get rich? The problem was, what do we do with too much money? This is where most resource states fail. They spend. They inflate bureaucracies. They subsidize consumption. They build monuments to ego. They assume the revenue will last forever. Qatar chose something colder. Tear, conversion. Because Sheikh Hamad understood a brutal truth of power. Cash is temporary. Ownership is durable. In 2005, Qatar created the Qatar Investment Authority, the QIA. On paper, it was a sovereign wealth fund. In reality, it was a transformation engine. The mandate was deceptively simple. Take surplus gas revenue and buy assets that will still generate income when gas no longer does. As of the mid-2020s, estimates place QIA's assets somewhere in the $500 to $600 billion range, depending on valuation and market cycles. Exact numbers are deliberately opaque. Capacity is part of the design, but the direction is unmistakable. This wasn't a pension fund. This was strategic embedding. Buying insurance, not returns. Qatar didn't build its portfolio the way a cautious investor would. It didn't quietly buy indexes and disappear. It bought symbols. It bought choke points. It bought things that powerful countries notice when they wobble. And nowhere is that strategy more visible than London. Walk through the city and you're effectively playing a strange game of geopolitical monopoly. Except the board is real, and Qatar owns pieces that are too important to ignore. Harrods, the Shard, large stakes in Canary Wharf, Heathrow Airport, luxury real estate developments tied to the Olympic legacy, significant positions in major UK institutions. Among financiers, there's a half-joke that London doesn't just host Qatari capital, it runs on it. That joke exists because there's truth underneath it. If Qatar vanished overnight, London wouldn't collapse, but markets would notice immediately. Asset prices would move. Banks would rebalance. Politicians would start making phone calls. This is not coincidence. This is how small states buy relevance. The logic of embedding. Qatar sits in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods on earth. Saudi Arabia to the west. Iran across the water. Regional rivalries older than modern borders. It cannot win wars by force. It cannot intimidate giants. So it follows a different doctrine. Make your survival inconvenient to everyone else. When your capital is woven into airports, banks, pension funds, and iconic landmarks, threatening you stops being a clean decision. It becomes a mess: financial, political, reputational. This is why Qatar didn't just buy assets in Britain, bought into Europe, into American real estate, into global finance, into corporations that sit inside other nations' economic plumbing. Ownership creates friction, and friction buys time. Soft power, louder than money, but capital alone doesn't shape narratives. Qatar learned early that if nobody hears your voice, your wealth will be explained by others, usually unkindly. So in 1996, Qatar launched what would become its most controversial instrument of influence: Al Jazeera. In the 1990s, Arab media was largely sterile. State TV, safe narratives. Leaders shaking hands with themselves. Debate was limited. Dissent was dangerous. Al Jazeera detonated that model. Suddenly, Arabic news involved argument. Panels shouted. Journalists questioned authority. The network aired voices that other channels would never touch, including Israeli officials and opposition figures across the Arab world. Its slogan, "The opinion and the other opinion," sounds mild today. At the time, it was revolutionary. And then came 9/11s. When wars erupted in Afghanistan and Iraq, Al Jazeera had something Western networks didn't: presence and access. It aired messages from groups the U.S. officially refused to platform. Washington was furious. Accusations flew. But here's the strategic twist. By broadcasting what others wouldn't, Al Jazeera became indispensable. Want to know what militant groups were saying? Want to understand sentiment on the Arab street? Want a channel people actually watched? You turned on Al Jazeera. Qatar didn't just build a news network. It built a regional information choke point. From influence to retaliation, of course. Influence attracts enemies. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt watched Al Jazeera's coverage of the Arab Spring with growing alarm. Regimes fell. Protests spread. Narratives slipped out of control. In their view, Qatar wasn't just rich, it was destabilizing. And in 2017, they decided to test how real Qatar's independence actually was. The blockade. Overnight, borders closed, airspace shut, diplomatic ties severed. Qatar's only land border through Saudi Arabia was sealed. This wasn't symbolism. It was a chokehold. Roughly 40% of Qatar's food imports once passed through that crossing. Supermarket shelves emptied within hours. Panic buying erupted. The message was explicit: submit or starve. For many countries, this is where sovereignty ends. Qatar responded by doing something that perfectly summarizes its entire strategy. It spent its way out. Ports were accelerated. Air routes rerouted. Supply chains rebuilt. And then came the moment that turned the blockade into legend: the cows. When dairy imports vanished, Qatar didn't negotiate. It airlifted thousands of cows, literally flew them in, and built an industrial dairy farm in the desert. complete with climate-controlled barns and automated milking systems. It was absurd, it was expensive, and it worked. Within months, Qatar achieved milk self-sufficiency. The blockade failed. Not because Qatar fought back, because it was too capitalized, too connected, and too adaptive to be strangled. And when the blockade ended years later, quietly, without concessions, one truth was clear. Qatar had crossed from wealthy to untouchable. But money and influence always come with a price. When you grow this rich, this fast, this visible, the world stops applauding and starts auditing. And when Qatar invited the entire planet to a football tournament, the scrutiny reached a level it had never experienced before. That's where the story turns uncomfortable. Because the next chapter isn't about gas or finance. It's about labor, morality, reputation, and the cost of building empires at speed. On December 2, 2010, a single word detonated inside a conference room in Zurich. Qatar. For a moment, the global football establishment froze. The United States delegation had expected to win. European officials were stunned. Fans around the world asked the same question at once. Why Qatar? No football culture at scale. No existing stadiums. A summer climate so brutal it can melt asphalt. A country smaller than Connecticut hosting the largest sporting event on Earth. But Qatar had something no one else brought to the table. Unlimited capital and the willingness to deploy it without hesitation. The most expensive tournament in history. Qatar didn't prepare for a World Cup. It rebuilt the country. New stadiums weren't dropped into existing cities. Entire districts were created. A metro system rose from scratch. Highways multiplied. The airport expanded into a global hub. An entirely new city licensed largely to host a final estimated cost. Around $200 billion when infrastructure is included. For comparison, Russia 2018, $11B, Brazil 2014, $15B. Qatar didn't compete. It overwhelmed, but speed has a shadow. And as cranes filled the skyline, another word entered global consciousness: kafala. The labor machine underneath the spectacle kafala was the labor sponsorship system long used across the Gulf. On paper, it regulated migrant employment. In practice, it tied workers mostly from South Asia to their employers with frightening rigidity. Jobs couldn't be changed without permission. Passports were often confiscated. Exit visas controlled movement. Abuse was difficult to escape. Human rights groups didn't hedge their language. They called it modern slavery. Then came the numbers. In 2021, The Guardian reported that over 6,500 migrant workers from 5 countries had died in Qatar since the World Cup was awarded. Qatar responded sharply. Officials argued the number included all deaths over a decade: car accidents, illnesses, non-work-related causes, not just stadium construction. FIFA echoed that the number of direct stadium-related deaths was far lower. Technically, both statements could be true. Morally, neither resolved the problem. Because what lived in the gap between them was a brutal reality. Young men working extreme hours in extreme heat. Crowded labor camps, deaths labeled natural causes for men in their 20s. Families receiving coffins with little explanation and often no compensation. Whether a death was work-related or not didn't change the central truth. Those men would likely still be alive if they hadn't gone to Qatar to work. Power under pressure for a moment, it looked like Qatar might lose control of the narrative. European teams discussed protests. Sponsors squirmed. Boycott Qatar trended worldwide. This was the first time Qatar faced sustained moral scrutiny at planetary scale. And here is where power reveals its real shape. Qatar did not cancel the World Cup. It did not surrender hosting rights. It did not issue sweeping apologies. Instead, it did 2 things. First, it reformed just enough. Under intense pressure, Qatar dismantled key elements of the kafala system. It introduced a minimum wage, allowed workers to change jobs without employer permission, improved heat protection rules. Critics argue enforcement remains inconsistent. They're not wrong, but the reforms were real. And in the Gulf, unprecedented. Second, Qatar waited. Because Qatar understood something uncomfortable about global attention, outrage has a half-life. When the opening whistle blew, the world did what it always does. It watched football. The matches were dramatic. The upsets were historic. The final was unforgettable. And when the Emir placed a traditional black and gold bisht over Lionel Messi's shoulders, that image went viral, streamed into billions of homes. Qatar had wrapped itself in football mythology. The criticism didn't vanish, but it lost momentum. This is the paradox of modern power. You don't need to be loved, you just need to be unavoidable. The deeper risk, but the World Cup wasn't Qatar's greatest danger. It was a distraction. Because while the world debated labor rights and stadium costs, Qatar was playing a far more dangerous game, one involving two rivals who despise each other and both matter to Qatar's survival: Iran and the United States. This is where the story stops being about money and starts being about balance on a knife edge. Because the gas field that made Qatar rich does not belong to Qatar alone. And the military base that keeps Qatar safe does not belong to Qatar either. That contradiction defines everything that comes next. If you want to understand Qatar, forget slogans like neutral, independent, or mediator. Those are PR words. Qatar is something far more dangerous and far more deliberate. It is a hinged state. A country designed not to choose sides but to make itself necessary to every side at once. The shared gas that binds enemies start with the resource that built everything: the North Field. On Qatar's side, it is called the North Field. On Iran's side, it is called South Pars. Two names, one geological structure. It is the largest non-associated natural gas reservoir on Earth, and it does not respect political borders. This fact alone dictates Qatar's foreign policy. Qatar cannot afford to be openly hostile to Iran. Iran cannot afford to destabilize the field without hurting itself. That shared dependency creates an invisible leash on both sides. If Qatar allowed its territory to be used as a launchpad for a direct attack on Iran, retaliation would not require invasion. It could come through sabotage, harassment of shipping lanes, or interference offshore enough to send LNG markets into panic. Gas is fragile. So Qatar keeps Iran close. Not friendly, not allied, but functional. That reality terrifies Washington, which is why Qatar does the other half of the balancing act. The American insurance policy just outside Doha sits Al Udeid Air Base. This is not symbolic. It is the largest U.S. military installation in the Middle East, the forward headquarters of U.S. Central Command, the nerve center for operations across the region. At various points, 8,000 to 10,000 U.S. personnel have been stationed or rotated through the base. From Al Udeid, the U.S. coordinated air operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. This geometry matters. Iran cannot move against Qatar without risking direct confrontation with U.S. forces. Saudi Arabia cannot pressure Qatar militarily without dragging American assets into the crisis. Qatar has embedded itself inside the American security architecture not as a client, but as a strategic node. This is not loyalty, it is insurance. The Switzerland model with enemies, Qatar goes even further. It hosts everyone: the U.S. military, the Taliban's political office, Hamas leadership, indirect Israeli contacts, Iranian channels. On paper, this looks insane. In practice, it is brilliant. When Washington needs a phone number, it cannot publicly dial. It calls Doha. When hostage negotiations happen, when evacuations collapse into chaos, when backchannels are required, Qatar becomes the room where impossible conversations happen. This makes everyone uncomfortable. Which is exactly the point. As long as Qatar is useful to everyone, no one can afford to crush it. But Qatar understands something crucial. Gas will not save them forever. Racing the clock even with the world's largest LNG expansion underway, Qatar knows the math. Decarbonization is accelerating. Electrification is spreading. Energy systems are shifting. Gas will outlive oil, but it will not outlive time. So Qatar is already building the post-gas state, quietly, methodically, without flashy slogans. Buying brains, not barrels, education city. Instead of sending its population abroad, Qatar imported universities: Cornell Medicine, Georgetown Foreign Service, Northwestern Journalism, Texas A&M Engineering, fully accredited, fully operational. The goal was never prestige. It was human capital density. In a future where resources matter less, talent matters more. This strategy is not immune to geopolitics. Texas A&M's announced exit is a warning shot, but the direction remains clear. Qatar wants mines onshore before gas loses relevance. Owning the digital plumbing, Qatar also understands something many countries miss about AI. The power isn't just in algorithms, it's in infrastructure. Data centers, compute, energy, capital through QIA. Qatar has quietly accumulated exposure to the backbone of the digital economy: AI infrastructure. Cloud assets, data platforms. A $20 billion partnership with Brookfield focused on AI infrastructure. Early exposure to frontier AI ecosystems. Strategic positions in compute-heavy assets. Qatar doesn't want to fuel the future. It wants to own the servers that run it. Soft power without spectacle tourism, too, but on Qatar's terms. Not party tourism, not mass tourism, curated luxury. Museums, diplomacy. High-end travel. Exclusivity as a brand. A place where a $15 coffee is not a mistake but a filter. The final truth: Qatar's story is not luck. It is leverage. A starving pearl economy collapsed. Oil stabilized but could not dominate. Gas was ignored till it wasn't. LNG transformed logistics into monopoly. Money was converted into ownership. Ownership into influence. Influence into insulation. Qatar learned the hardest lesson in geopolitics early. Small states don't survive by being loud or righteous. They survive by being indispensable. But history offers a warning. The pearl divers of the 1920s also believed their industry would last forever. Markets change, technology shifts. Demand evaporates. Nothing pearls, oil, gas, or even a $500 billion energy empire's permanent. The question isn't whether Qatar understands that. The question is whether it's moving fast enough to outrun it. If you want to see the other side of this model, how a resource state tried to do everything right, watch the next video on Norway, the good twin of Qatar. Thanks for watching. Sleep well. The gas keeps flowing. For now.